Okay, thanks very much. So I feel like if I knew that I was going to be broadcast to this room, I would have made sure my office wasn't quite such a tip. But here we are anyway. Many exciting things going on here. So thanks very much for having me. As the introduction said, my name is J Melendez Torrez, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about how to sell yourself and how to sell your project. I'm not sure entirely what expertise I have in selling myself or selling your project, but as someone who is a very keen observer of others selling themselves and selling their projects, including as chair of one of the NIHR selection committees, I hope I'll be able to share some of that experience with you. So broadly, I'm going to start by making a few really grand statements about science, and then I'm going to use that to talk a little bit about how you sell yourself, how you sell your project, and what an elevator pitch might look like that incorporates both of those. I just want to start at the beginning by saying that I have no PowerPoint slides because the problem with PowerPoints is that they often don't have much power and don't have much point. But if you would like to email me afterwards, I'd be very happy to share my notes in written form. Okay, so just with a few headline observations around science and the research that we do. So every so often we talk about science having a paradigm shift. Okay, this is what sociologists of science refer to as what happens when you have a major discovery or a change that really impacts how we understand the phenomena that we investigate. Okay, for those of us who are epidemiologists, John Snow's work on the Broad Street pump counts as a paradigm shift. It changed how we understood infectious disease outbreaks. Management scholars refer to these as well as frame-breaking changes, changes that break the frame of what we understand is possible and what we understand could be the case, and how we think about what is possible and what could be the case in terms of the phenomena that we study. One of the challenges that we face, perhaps, as researchers in health is that a lot of our research is incremental knowledge, but that incremental knowledge is very important. Now, to my mind, what unites those paradigm shifts, those frame-breaking changes, and all that incremental knowledge is that these are all revolutions, large and small. They're revolutions in how we understand the world, in how we understand the population health impacts that we're trying to generate, and in how we understand what is possible for ourselves, for our communities, and for our world in terms of the healthier futures that we can imagine. So I want to start with this idea about paradigm shifts, frame-breaking changes, and incremental knowledge to suggest that the work that we do is about creating revolutions large and small. So the question I have for all of you is, what is the site of your revolution? When we think about selling ourselves, to use the term, the question we should be asking ourselves is, what is the site of your revolution? Where do you want to go to have that impact and to make that change, to generate that transformational shift in how we understand population health? When we think about the site of our revolution, there are a few things that come before and a few things that come after. And each of these things is important in terms of understanding how we sell ourselves. The first one of those is trajectory. Where have you come from? Where are you going? Having a sense of your own trajectory, both in terms of how your past experiences have made you the researcher that you are now, and also in terms of where you could be going as a researcher in the future, is a really important part of selling yourself. Having a really deep knowledge and understanding of your own experience and then trajectory is really the starting point in knowing how to sell yourself. The second point is, if you're thinking about a specific opportunity like an NIHR fellowship, why this? Why now in your trajectory? What would be the impact of this for you right now? As a chair of an NIHR selection committee, one of the things that really drives me around the bend is when I get applications from people who are very smart, very intelligent, and could really have that impact that we want to see in health and population well-being, but who don't tell me exactly why this award is essential for them right now in their trajectory. And that award can be a personal award, like a fellowship. It can also be a project grant that can really set you up to do the work down the line that you need to do to create that revolution. So when it comes to selling yourself, you want to understand what your trajectory is, but you also want to understand why this opportunity, why now in your trajectory, and you lose absolutely nothing by being extremely explicit about that. The third point is impact, your own personal impact as a researcher. What has it been and what will it be? When we think about impact, we often think about impact in terms of, have we demonstrated that an entire group of people, for example, have meaningfully changed their health status. It's a very important, but it's a relatively narrow account of what impact is and what it could be. What are the impacts that you have had on academic communities? What are the impacts that you have had on practice communities? What are the impacts you've had on your local NHS trust or integrated care board? What are the impacts that you might have had on national guidelines? What are the impacts that you might have had in terms of your work being cited in other places? Taking a broad view of what your impact has been, and that impact could be very narrow if you are just finishing up your PhD, and it could be much broader if you're preparing for an advanced fellowship. But taking a broad view as to what that impact is and where that impact will go in the future is a critical part of selling yourself and of understanding your own trajectory as well. The final point I just want to say when it comes to selling yourself is a stylistic point, but it reveals a lot about how you understand your own contribution and your own trajectory. And that is the balance of how we talk about I and we when we write about the research that we do in applications. You don't want to overclaim, but you also don't want to undersell. And being really clear and very specific about which parts of that research delivery were I and which parts of those research delivery was we is really key to show that you understand yourself as a developing researcher in the context of a trajectory and also in the context of a trajectory of impact that will take you forward as well. So that's selling yourself. Now I want to talk about selling your project. And again, to pick up on this point of revolutions, if selling yourself is about asking what is the site of your revolution, selling your project is about asking how will this project spark that revolution that you want to create. There's an essential part of this that is background knowledge and that you really can't get away without having done your homework, and that's to do with feasibility and remit. Have you sought out the expert advice that you need to seek out in order to just be very clear that what you're proposing to do is within remit for your funder? You need to just be very clear that what you're applying for actually meets the requirements and specifications of the funder in order to ensure that you're not wasting your time and you're not wasting anyone else's time as well. And that expert advice can come from a range of sources. That can come from your university research services office, that can come from a mentor or a PI, or that can come from your local research design service. Having addressed that really basic sine qua non, the next thing you want to think about how your project will spark that revolution is thinking about the ways that your substantive focus and your methods are in synergy with each other. It's really frustrating to see an application that reveals a very sophisticated account of the substantive issues that the application is trying to address, but ultimately is let down by a very thin account of methods. The converse also happens as well. People who go absolutely nuts writing extremely lush method sections with no real deep understanding of the substantive aspects. I know a lot about the second one because I've been in that position a few times myself. But just being really clear about how the substantive work that you're doing links to the methods that you're planning to use and how the methods can help you drive that knowledge in the substance, I think is a really key way to stand out from the rest and to show how your work will spark that revolution. The third point is about impact. And as you gathered, impact is probably one of my favorite words. You want to think not just about your own trajectory of impact, but about your project's trajectory of impact. What is a record of impact that underpins the project that you're trying to undertake? And what are the impacts that you hope your project will create? Again, that impact can occur at multiple levels and in multiple ways, but needs to be explicit, concrete, and plausible. So one of the points I want you to think about is if you do this work now to the highest standard, what are the impacts you'll have in the short term? How will those lead to impacts in the medium term? And how will those generate the longest term impacts in terms of meaningful shifts in population health? Really nailing that account of impact and understanding not just how those impacts will unfold over time, but what you will do to realize those is a good way to avoid the interesting but irrelevant problem. The final point I want to raise about selling your project is just to have recourse to the idea that involvement and engagement of the public is absolutely central to all of this. One of the things that I think has been most surprising to me in my own developing career has been the degree to which I've turned to involvement and engagement as being so absolutely focal to my own work. My background is primarily as a medical statistician, and so I think I took the view, as many of my statistician colleagues do, that involvement and engagement is something that other people do. In reality, involvement and engagement is for everyone. And doing it well, doing it to a high standard, and doing it with care and caution and with due regard to the groups that you're working with is not only an important way to help your application stand out from the pack, but also, and this is really important, to show how involvement and engagement has informed every part of your work, from prioritizing the issues to considering the methods that are best, to thinking about how you're going to create and leverage those impacts in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. I don't care if you are a super ultra clinical researcher in the lab with a pipette. I don't care if you're a health economist or a medical statistician. Being good at involvement and engagement is a skill for everyone, and it's a skill that will help you sell your project effectively as well. So putting all this together is the elevator pitch. Now, I always think the phrase elevator pitch is a little bit weird because I've never known anyone to be on an elevator for 5 minutes, which is about as long as elevator pitches tend to go. But it's a term that we use. In short, what you want to do in an elevator pitch is sell yourself and sell your project. And in order to do that, what I'd suggest you return to are these key questions. What is the site of your revolution? Why are you, right here and right now, the one to lead that revolution? And how will your project spark that revolution? Thinking through those 3 points and threading those together to create your elevator pitch, I think is the best way that you can sell yourself and sell your project, whether it's at the start of an interview, the start of your Viva, the start of a fellowship panel, or the start of a job interview. So I look forward to seeing and hearing about your revolutions in the future. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
DJ, thank you so much for that. I love kind of contextualizing what's your revolution, because ultimately it is around, what is it that you want to change, be it a fellowship, be it a project, and to have that passion that this is something really important in convincing the panel. So I'm going to look for questions while we're getting some questions online. Can I just ask, one of the things, you were talking about is impact and the impact on, in terms of trajectory for you, the why now, the impact of why this is important, the impact of what you're actually going to do. Often, absolutely agree it's critical, but because it's not, there's in a lot of grant applications, it's not a section for it. Can I ask some suggestions about how you weave this through your narrative, whether or not it's the narrative of the personal story or the narrative of your revolution?
So I think if you're talking about project impact, I think there are a few ways that you can really sneak that in. One of those is talk about dissemination and thinking about why that dissemination is the best way to help you get to those impacts as well. If you read a dissemination section that says we're going to publish some papers, it's going to be great, thanks. That's not going to be super satisfying. If you think we're going to publish these papers, we're also going to do these workshops, and we might deliver these training resources that might be useful CPD for people in the field to help get those messages out there, that starts to feel a lot more like you have a handle on what that impact is. Many NIHR applications now ask you to talk about how your outputs will enter the social health and care system. That's another really good way to get to that point about impact, because the point of getting those outputs into the system is to create that impact. So thinking about what that is will also help you work backwards to thinking about what are the best ways that you can get those outputs into the system.
Brilliant. And I guess the whole impact is so critical in so many different levels, and it's really important to contextualise it for the type of grant that you're going towards. I think we have a question, or we've got a couple of questions. Do we have any online as well? Okay, down in the back of the room.
Lovely presentation. I was wondering how to give them some practical tips maybe on how would you balance the I versus we, especially at a young age, when you couldn't have done anything if the group wasn't there, of course. So you need to tell yourself, balancing that, I guess. So.
Okay, so I think often there is a lot of reflexive use of we that is unhelpful. Okay, if you were the lead analyst, designed a paper, brought the analysis to completion, and then wrote it all up, saying we wrote this paper, or we led this paper, it's unnecessary, right? You led the paper. You led a team of co-authors, but you led the paper, okay? Thinking about those of us who work in more clinical labs, I agree that it's a little bit trickier, but I think it's possible to distinguish what is the impact that we have collectively as a lab versus what is the impact that I have had specifically through the meaningful, detailed, and concrete contributions I made to that program of work. So I think we get to the difference between the I and the we when we're talking about the broad direction of travel versus the very concrete things that we have done in order to deliver on that work and on that impact. Does that help?
Yes, a nod. We have an online question.
Yeah, so from Kerry at UCL, she's asked, can I ask how clinical your impact should be for NIHR? For example, is it acceptable for the impact to be more political, grounded in global approaches to health issues?
That is an interesting question. I think all impact is good impact. So I think, if the impact is there, claim it, right? I mean, I think a lot of that depends on the specific call that you're going for. Obviously, if you're going for a global health program call, that's going to look a little bit different than if you're going for RFPB, right? Fine. However, any account of impact is useful, especially if you can relate it back to your local context, or if you can trace that impact to the work that you have done specifically. But I think that answer is probably a little bit too context dependent on the specific call you're going for to be able to give you a blanket answer.
So can I also add that go back to the aims of the NIHR, and if what you're talking about fulfills the aims of the NIHR, it's absolutely within remit. And sometimes we don't think about the really impactful elements of changing policy. And I can say that Lucy Chappell is really encouraging her research profs to come in and spend some time in the Department of Health and Social Care because this is such an important area. So absolutely relevant to kind of what it is that the funder is actually asking for. Any other questions? Yes, we have one there and one here. So we'll take the one at the back first and then any online and one online. Okay.
Hiya, thanks for your presentation. I was just curious about the PPIE component, which I feel like is very tied to resourcing and funding. And so I feel like it's quite difficult to maybe integrate that prior to a funding application where maybe there aren't the funds, because you have participant compensation, you have compensating community partners. It can quickly spiral when you then add in venue and whatever. So I was just kind of commenting on, building in PPIE, particularly in the priority stages, is quite hard, especially if you want to acknowledge appropriately or fund those activities, and maybe some advice on how you bring in PPI when maybe there isn't the funding in place from the start.
Yeah, so I think that relies on a very specific understanding of what PPI is, which is essentially a series of vox pops that require catering and a space. In my experience, involvement and engagement is much broader than that, right? And that's not to sidestep the point about resourcing, which you're right, that is often an issue. But in my experience, many of our higher ed contexts have small pots of funding that can speed that process along. I think what I would stress to you is that good involvement and engagement doesn't look like a series of vox pops necessarily. And in fact, if that's all that has been done, that's often a red flag. You want to think carefully around the conversations you've had with commissioners, with broader stakeholders. Some of those people might be professionals, right? And a lot of that PPI are things that you generate in the course of having conversations with people generally, as opposed to sitting someone down and collecting their views. So I'd encourage you to think with breadth and creativity around what counts as involvement and engagement for your work, but also, again, acknowledging that the resource situation is real. Think about where you have pots of funding internal to your institution that you can pick those up.
Brilliant, thank you. And we will be doing more of around this particular issue this afternoon.
Hi, my name is Poppy. I was wondering how important the narrative of our trajectory is in terms of a clear pathway. So like for those of us who might have had to take on other jobs or not be able to go directly down the routes that we wanted to, is it still useful to show that we have capacity for like frame breaking changes, even if it's in entirely different topics, or is that just a bit irrelevant and you'd rather see that passion for one thing all the way through?
I think that's all part of the story, right? And I think I would encourage you to not create gaps where you don't need to have them. I think that's all part of the conversation. I mean, I wrote my PhD on a radically different topic than what I'm working on at the moment, and that was all part of that journey. So I would think about what you gained from those past experiences that perhaps feel more peripheral to what you want to be doing, and then think about what that learning can do in terms of setting you up to create that revolution that you want to create.
Brilliant. And it goes back to what we were saying before. Even though there are pathways, usually the most interesting and successful are those that aren't necessarily linear. So, changes and kind of unexpected journeys is kind of absolutely should be celebrated. Vicky, online?
We've got loads of questions.
Oh.
How much time do we have?
We could
We'll
probably
keep going.
3 minutes, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so first one's from Tricia. As a nurse myself, it's inspiring to hear from someone with a nursing background, as often clinical priorities impact on ability to get involved in research. I'd be interested to know how you move from clinical to focusing on research.
Aren't nurses the best? I think they're the best. Anyway, maybe I shouldn't say that at an NIHR event, but here we are. So I think what I would say to that is that my research interests were driven specifically by the clinical encounters that I had, okay? And I think I also just understood very clearly that the research I wanted to be doing was directly sparked by the kind of clinical work I had been doing, particularly with regard to the work in public health and in psychiatric and mental health, which is what I was kind of the bulk of my clinical experience before I began working as an academic. The other thing I would just say to you is that, the situation that NIHR has now in terms of encouraging clinical academic careers, especially for those of us who are moving from clinical careers as AHPs and nurses into research, is so much more expansive than it was when I started my PhD back in 2011. So thinking through what those opportunities are and how the different opportunities that are available to you, including PCAF, can smooth the way, I think is just so important.
And can I just say, watch this space. There'll be more announced very soon. Yep.
So microphone back on. Do you think there's a risk when thinking about non-scientific elements, cultural values, political shifts, etc., that intrude into science and create paradigm shift, that we might come across as overselling our own unique contributions? For example, if we're making a case for a complete change in methodological approach, might we be criticised for being too far outside the currently accepted paradigm?
So I think I was very clear in the early part of my presentation that you don't want to oversell and overclaim. But I think I was also very clear that a lot of the work that we do is incremental, and each incremental contribution that we make is its own small revolution. I would be very surprised if someone wrote an NIHR doctoral fellowship application seeking to reinvent the world of medical statistics. That would be pretty wild. I would like to see that. But I do think that there is room to build and shape the kinds of methodological innovation that we do. For example, work funded by NIHR has been absolutely central to developing and iterating the utility of evidence synthesis methods in the UK and around the world. We're now using methods that didn't exist 10 years ago, but that have already delivered meaningful impacts in terms of providing the information policymakers need to make better and more confident decisions. So all of these revolutions are incremental, right? And particularly at doctoral level, no, you're not going to reinvent the world of cancer biology. You're not going to invent the world of multiple sclerosis therapeutics, but you will make an incremental contribution to knowledge that is in itself its own small revolution. And I think being very clear on what that is, what its limits are, and where you go next, I think is all part of that story.
Brilliant, thank you. Jay, thank you so much for joining us from Exeter. I really appreciate your not use of PowerPoint. I love that, and the way that that you framed kind of selling yourself. So thank you so much. I'm sure people will be in contact about your notes, and so if we can thank GJ.